The landlady's words were a logical impossibility. "She's burnt to a crisp," she said, but there was no fire. Inside the apartment, a pile of fine grey ash and a shrunken skull sat on a perfectly clean rug. A delicate satin slipper, completely untouched, rested beside it. This wasn't a crime scene. It was a violation of reality itself. How can a person burn from the inside out? What kind of fire leaves no trace, except for a victim reduced to dust? In the thick, wet heat of St. Petersburg, Florida in 1951, the air inside the city's police bullpen was a sluggish, living thing. Ceiling fans wobbled on their stems, doing little more than rearranging the humidity and the smell of stale coffee and cigarettes. The room was a symphony of chaos. Phones ringing, typewriters clattering, men shouting, but Detective Frank Karras heard none of it. His world had shrunk to the four corners of his desk, an island of meticulous order in an ocean of noise. He was arranging photographs from a pawn shop robbery, laying them out in a perfect grid. Each glossy black and white print was aligned with the edge of his green blotter, its corners forming flawless right angles. A photo of the smashed display case. A photo of the muddy footprint. A photo of the back alley window, its latch broken. To Karras, these were not just pictures. They were sequential data points in a logical chain. A story that, if read correctly, would lead to one inescapable conclusion. His partner, Detective Miller, a younger man whose suit was still crisp and whose outlook was still sunny, leaned against the desk, watching with a kind of baffled admiration. "I still don't know how you did it, Frank," Miller said, shaking his head. "We had nothing. No witnesses, no weapon. And you pull the guy's name out of thin air just by looking at a receipt." Karras didn't look up. He nudged a photo of the cash register a millimeter to the left, his focus absolute. "It wasn't thin air, Miller. The thief wore cheap work boots. You saw the print. But he bought a silver locket, something expensive, sentimental. Men who wear those boots don't buy silver lockets unless it's for a woman they're desperate to impress. The receipt for the locket was smudged with grease, but not just any grease. It was graphite grease, the kind they use on the gears at the city rail yard." He finally looked up, his eyes weary but sharp. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much chaos in the world and had responded by vowing to master every detail within his reach. It was a vow he'd made in the rubble of Europe, a promise to himself that the universe was not, in fact, governed by random cruelty, but by rules. You just had to be smart enough to see them. "I checked the employee roster at the rail yard," Karras continued, his voice a low monotone. "Found a mechanic named Gus Petrovich who was passed over for a promotion last week. A man with a new grudge, a new girlfriend, and not enough money to buy her the things he thought she deserved. He was still wearing the boots when we picked him up. The locket was in his pocket." He tapped the final photograph, a mugshot of a sullen-looking man. "People are creatures of habit, Miller, not ghosts. They leave tracks, not omens." Miller just grinned, shaking his head. "Whatever you say, Frank, it was still magic." Karras flinched almost imperceptibly at the word. Magic was a lie. It was a comforting story people told themselves to explain a world they were too lazy to understand. There was only cause and effect, action and reaction, crime and evidence. That was the mantra that kept the screaming memories of the war at bay. That was the shield. "Fitz has got something for you, Frank," the desk sergeant yelled across the room. Karras's focus broke. He watched Sergeant Fitz amble over, a slip of paper held between two thick fingers. Karras felt a familiar wave of annoyance. Another case, another disruption, another set of messy facts to be wrestled into orderly submission. Fitz dropped the note on his desk, landing it askew on his perfect grid. Karras resisted the urge to straighten it. "Got a weird one for you," Fitz said, scratching his chin. "Landlady called it in over on Cherry Street. Says she smelled smoke, went to check on her tenant. Says there was no fire." Miller leaned in, his curiosity piqued. "No fire?" Karras let out a tired sigh, finally picking up the note. He glanced at the address. It was probably a drunk who'd passed out with a cigarette, singed a cushion, and the landlady was in a panic over nothing. It was always nothing. "No fire? Or the fire was out when she got there, Fitz?" Karras asked, his tone already dismissive. Fitz shrugged, his expression unreadable. "That's the thing. She was very specific. She said, 'There's no fire, but she's burnt to a crisp.'" A beat of silence hung between the three men. Miller's eyebrows shot up. Karras scoffed, a short, sharp burst of sound. The statement was a contradiction, a logical impossibility. Therefore, it was wrong. The witness was hysterical, or stupid, or both. He crumpled the note slightly in his fist, the neat paper becoming a messy ball of nonsense. "Right," he said, standing up and grabbing his coat. "Let's go see what this lady's been drinking." The drive to Cherry Street was hot and sticky. Karras's Ford had no air conditioning, and the humid air that blasted through the open windows felt like the breath of a furnace. The building was a modest, two-story apartment block, its white paint peeling in the relentless Florida sun. It looked painfully, reassuringly normal. There were no fire trucks, no columns of smoke, no signs of anything out of the ordinary. It was exactly as he expected. Except for the people, a small crowd of neighbors was gathered on the patchy lawn, clustered together like nervous sheep. They weren't panicked or screaming. They were whispering, their faces a pale mixture of fear and a strange, morbid excitement. As Karras and Miller pushed through them, Karras caught snippets of their hushed, superstitious chatter. "Always said she had a darkness in her. Kept to herself. Never went to church. It's God's judgment, I tell you. A warning to the rest of us." Karras's expression hardened. He'd heard this kind of talk before. It was the sound of fear looking for an easy answer, the first refuge of minds unwilling to confront a difficult reality. It was noise, useless, distracting noise that clouded the facts. He pushed past the last of them, his professional indifference a shield against their backward thinking. A trembling, bird-like woman in a housecoat met them at the door. Mrs. Pansy Carpenter, the landlady. "Oh, thank God you're here, detective," she whispered, wringing her hands. "I didn't know who else to call. It's unnatural. Just show us the apartment, ma'am," Karras said, his voice gentle but firm. She led them up a narrow flight of stairs to the second floor, to apartment 2B. She fumbled with the key, her hand shaking so badly she could barely fit it in the lock. Karras took it from her and opened the door himself. The first thing that hit him was the smell. It wasn't the familiar, acrid smell of burnt wood or fabric. It was a sharp, chemical odor, clean and alien, like the air after a lightning strike. Ozone. The second thing he noticed was the profound, unsettling tidiness of the room. A small, neat sitting room, a doily on the arm of a sofa, a stack of newspapers next to an end table, perfectly squared. Nothing was out of place. There was no soot on the pale floral wallpaper, no black stains on the white ceiling. Everything was pristine. Everything was wrong. And then he saw it. In the far corner of the room, there was an empty space where an armchair should have been. In its place, on the worn but undamaged rug, was a neat circular pile of fine grey ash. It was a shockingly small pile, no more than 10 or 15 pounds of material. In the very centre of the ash sat a single blackened object. It took Karras a moment to recognise its shape. It was a human skull, but it was shrunken, calcified, condensed by a heat so intense it had boiled away all moisture and fat, leaving something no bigger than a teacup. And there, right beside the ash pile, resting on the clean rug, was a single slipper. It was made of pale blue satin, delicate and fragile. It was completely untouched. Karras stopped dead. His methodical mind, a machine built to process logical inputs and produce rational outputs, ground to a screeching metallic halt. Every law of the physical world he knew screamed that this was impossible. To reduce a human body to this state, a process called calcination, required a furnace. It required temperatures of 2,000 or 3,000 degrees sustained for hours. A fire that hot would have gutted the entire apartment, burned through the floor, and brought the roof down. It would have left the walls black with soot and melted the windows. Yet here, the newspapers sat unburnt. The satin slipper lay unsinged. He tried to form a hypothesis. A blowtorch? No, too localized and not hot enough. A new kind of chemical accelerant? No, that would have left residue, and the smell would be different. A bomb? No, there was no concussion damage. Every theory he grasped at dissolved into absurdity in the face of the quiet, impossible scene before him. The gears of his logic seized. The world, which had always been a book of rules, had just presented him with a page written in a language he could not read. For the first time in his career, maybe in his entire life, Detective Frank Karras stood before a mystery and had no idea what to do next. He had no leads. He had no suspects. He had no theories. He had nothing. He just stared at the shrunken skull and the single, perfect satin slipper. A man of answers who had suddenly run out. In 1951, St. Petersburg, Florida, Detective Frank Karras, a man who lives by logic and tangible evidence, solves a robbery through meticulous deduction, reinforcing his belief that every event has a rational explanation. He is then called to a bizarre scene where a landlady reports a tenant is burnt to a crisp, but that there was no fire. Karras, dismissing this as hysteria, arrives at a normal-looking apartment building where he is met with superstitious gossip from neighbors. Inside the apartment, his entire worldview is shattered when he discovers a small pile of ash containing a shrunken human skull, while the room itself, including a delicate satin slipper next to the ash, is completely untouched by fire. The impossible scene violates all known laws of physics, leaving the methodical detective without any logical hypothesis. The memory of the flickering flashlight and the phantom whisper in Mary Reeser's apartment had become a splinter in Frank Karras's mind. For days, it had festered. The coroner's report had come back confirming the impossible. No accelerants, no external heat source, nothing. The case was a vacuum, a void in the ordered world of cause and effect that Karras inhabited. The official investigation had stalled, becoming a piece of departmental folklore, the Human Torch case that everyone joked about but no one wanted. Everyone but Karras. He couldn't let it go. He had one clue, one single piece of data that didn't fit. The strange, circular scorch mark under the rug, and the cold, static feeling it had left on his fingertips. It was the only tangible thing in a case built of smoke and whispers, and he clung to it like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. He took the small square of floorboard he'd cut from the apartment to the one place he thought he might find an answer that wasn't rooted in gossip or ghosts: the university physics department. The lab was a different world from the humid chaos of the bullpen. It was sterile, cool, and quiet, filled with the low, steady hum of transformers and vacuum pumps. It smelled of clean electricity and sterilized metal. It was a temple to reason. Professor Eamon Egan was a man who seemed assembled from wire and tweed, with spectacles as thick as bottle glass, and a mind that moved with a quiet, frictionless precision. He took the sample from Karras without much interest, placing it under a powerful microscope. Karras waited, his hands shoved in his pockets, feeling like a primitive man presenting a strange rock to an oracle. Curious, Egan murmured after a long silence, his eyes still pressed to the lens. This isn't a burn pattern, not in the traditional sense. He moved the sample to a different machine, a bulky spectrograph that hissed and clicked as he activated it. A typical combustion, say from a dropped match or even a chemical fire, leaves a specific carbon signature. The cellular structure of the wood is blackened, broken down. This is different. He fiddled with a dial, and a line of jagged green light appeared on a small oscilloscope screen. The cells aren't burned, they're crystallized. The water inside them was flash-boiled, and the lignin structure was subjected to an intense, focused energy. It's almost as if each cell was individually cooked from the inside out. Karras leaned forward, his heart beginning to beat faster. Cooked with what? Egan removed his glasses, polishing them on his tie. High-frequency electromagnetic radiation. Microwaves, to be blunt, detective. An immense, targeted burst of them. We're only just beginning to understand the applications of this technology in our radar systems. To see it used this way, it's unprecedented. He pointed to the spectrograph's printout. And there's more. Trace deposits. Microscopic flecks of melted copper and vaporized quartz. Components of a sophisticated oscillator or magnetron. This wasn't a fire, Detective Karras. This scorch mark was made by a device. A wave of profound, intoxicating relief washed over Karras. It was a physical sensation. A loosening in his chest he hadn't realized was there. A device. A machine. Something built by human hands. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a curse from God. It was a weapon. A death ray. Something out of a Buck Rogers serial, but real, tangible, and most importantly, traceable. His world, which had been tilting on its axis, snapped back into plumb. He had a solid scientific lead. He had a killer again. Energized by the new lead, Karras bypassed the police station and went straight to the downtown library, to the newspaper archive in the basement. The air was thick with the musty smell of decaying paper, the scent of forgotten history. If there was a secret death ray in his city, someone, somewhere, had to be talking about it. Fringe scientists, amateur inventors, cranks. He needed to find them. He spent hours hunched over a clunky microfilm reader, the spools clicking and whirring as decades of St. Petersburg history flickered past his eyes. He scanned headlines, looking for anything related to strange electrical phenomena, rogue inventors, or weapons research. He found nothing but grainy pictures of smiling politicians and reports of citrus harvests. Just as his eyes began to blur with fatigue, a small headline from a 1931 edition of the St. Petersburg Post caught his eye. Local society seeks to photograph the soul. His interest piqued. He zoomed in. The article was about a group calling itself the Edison Society for Vital Energies. It described their efforts to prove the existence of a human bioelectric field, an aura, using a combination of high-voltage photography and psychic mediums. Karras almost dismissed it as nonsense, another dead end filled with charlatans. But then he saw the photograph accompanying the article. It showed 5 men in lab coats standing proudly around a seated young woman. In her hands, she held a strange rod-like device wrapped in copper wire, attached by cables to a humming electrical cabinet behind her. The woman was smiling shyly at the camera, a look of nervous pride on her face. Karras felt a jolt, a shock of recognition that went cold in his stomach. He knew that face. It was a younger, brighter, less haunted version of the woman in the file on his desk. It was Mary Reeser. The name of the Edison Society's founder listed in the article, Alistair Abernathy, led Karras to a dusty antiquarian bookshop downtown. The place was a labyrinth of towering shelves crammed with esoteric texts on alchemy, theosophy, and forgotten religions. It smelled of old leather and ozone, the same unsettling smell from Mary's apartment. He found Mr. Abernathy behind a mountain of books, a wisp of a man in his 70s with ink-stained fingers and eyes that seemed to be focused on a world just beyond this one. "The Edison Society," Abernathy said, his voice a dry rustle. "My goodness, I haven't thought about that in years." He gestured for Karras to sit. "We were scientists, you see, not mystics. We believed the soul wasn't a matter of faith, but a matter of physics. An energy field that could be measured, quantified, and perhaps even focused." "A pyroelectric field, you called it," Karras said, testing the phrase. Abernathy's eyes lit up. "Precisely. You've done your reading. Most people laughed at us. But we had proof, or rather, we had Mary." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Mary was special, detective, a prodigy. She could sit in our Faraday cage, and with nothing but her focus, she could make the needles on our galvanometers jump. She could raise the temperature in a sealed beaker by a degree or two, just by concentrating on it. We were on the verge of a breakthrough. Proof that the mind could exert physical force on the world. What happened? Karras asked. Abernathy's face fell. She became afraid. The ability, it was growing stronger, less predictable. She started talking about a heat inside her, something she couldn't control. Said she was afraid she would ignite. He shook his head sadly. The end came when she was reading in our library. She got agitated, I don't remember why. She slammed the book shut, and when she did, the cover smoldered. Left a black, charred handprint right on the leather. He looked at Karras, his eyes wide with the memory. She ran from the building that day and never came back. She was terrified of the fire within. Karras left the bookshop with a heavy cardboard box in his hands. It was filled with the old research notes Mary had left behind when she fled the society. Abernathy had kept them all these years, a memento of a dream that had died. Karras drove back to his apartment, his mind racing. A weapon. Abernathy's story had only solidified his theory. Mary had learned how to focus this energy, this internal fire, and someone else in that group had weaponized it, perfected it, and finally turned it back on her. He just had to find the proof in those notes. Late into the night, he sat at his kitchen table, a single lamp casting a pool of light on the yellowed papers. He pored over them, searching for a name, a threat, a clue to an external enemy. But he found none. Instead, he found page after page of Mary's own frantic, looping handwriting, a desperate blend of scientific notation and panicked diary entries. The field is unstable. It spikes without warning. Another fever today. Felt the heat behind my eyes. I need a regulator, a shunt to ground the excess charge. It builds without my control. I'm afraid to sleep. Then he found the schematics. Dozens of them. Complex circuit diagrams that made little sense to him, but the components were clear. Copper wiring, quartz crystal oscillators, capacitor banks. He was looking at the designs for a portable, focusable energy device. This was it, the weapon. He felt a grim satisfaction. But as he turned to the final, most detailed schematic, his blood ran cold. He recognized the specific arrangement of the melted components the professor had found on the floorboard. He saw the power source, the oscillator, the emitter, and he saw how they were all wired into a harness, designed to be worn. And then he saw the title, neatly printed in Mary's own hand at the top of the page. It did not say emitter or projector. It said Emergency Field Suppressor, Mark IV. It wasn't a weapon. It was a cage. It wasn't designed to project energy outward. It was designed to contain an energy that was already building inside. The schematic fell from his fingers. He stared at the crime scene photos spread across his table, his mind working furiously, the gears grinding and screaming as they were forced into reverse. He saw it all with horrifying new clarity. The lack of a struggle, the tidy room, the single, untouched slipper. She had been sitting in her favorite chair, perhaps dozing off. The device she had built to save herself, the last line of defense against her own internal fire, had failed. It wasn't a murder. It was an accident. A horrible, impossible internal accident. He stumbled back from the table, his chair scraping loudly on the linoleum. He bumped into his desk, sending a pile of his perfectly ordered, logical case files scattering across the floor. The neat, rational world he had so carefully constructed around himself dissolved into smoke. The killer he had been hunting for was an illusion. The evil had never been external. It had been locked inside her all along. He stood in the middle of his wrecked apartment, adrift in a sea of the impossible. The shield was broken. The rules were gone. He whispered the terrifying truth to the empty, silent room. She didn't get burned, he choked out. She burned. The shattering of a worldview is not a loud, explosive event. It is a quiet, internal collapse. It is the sound of silence where there used to be answers. For Detective Frank Karras, that silence was deafening. He found himself in a dive bar on the edge of town, a place that smelled of spilled beer and regret. He didn't remember driving there. The glass of whiskey in his hand felt alien, a prop in a play he didn't know he was in. His notebook lay open on the sticky bar top, a perfect diagram of his fractured mind. On the left-hand page were his own neat, blocky letters detailing Professor Egan's findings. High-frequency electromagnetic radiation, crystallized cellular structure, melted copper and quartz. It was the language of science, of knowable things. On the right-hand page were photocopies of Mary Reeser's frantic, looping script, filled with words that had no place in his vocabulary. Inner fire, unstable field, a curse of the blood. Science and superstition staring at each other across the spine of the notebook, at war for his soul. "Frank, what in God's name are you doing here?" Karras looked up. His partner, Miller, was standing over him, his face a mask of concern. He must have called the station, told them he was taking a personal day, and Miller, ever loyal, had come looking for him. "You look like hell," Miller said, sliding onto the stool next to him. He glanced at the notebook. "Still on this Reeser thing?" "Frank, the chief is ready to close it. Death by misadventure. Freak accident. You're the only one still trying to make it make sense." Karras took a long pull from his whiskey. The burn a welcome, familiar sensation in a world that had become utterly strange. "Because it doesn't make sense, Miller. None of it. It's a spook story, Frank. You said it yourself. Witnesses get hysterical. They see things. The coroner said it was probably the wick effect, some weird slow burn with body fat. It's rare, but it's possible. It's a better explanation than this." Miller tapped the page with Mary's handwriting. Karras just shook his head, a slow, tired motion. How could he explain it? How could he tell his partner, a man who lived in the same black and white world Karras himself had inhabited just a week ago, that the evidence pointed to the impossible? That the laws of physics had taken a holiday in that small apartment on Cherry Street? "Her son," Karras murmured, more to himself than to Miller. He lied. "I asked him if his mother had enemies, if she was involved in anything strange. He said no. He knew. He must have known." "Knew what? That she was playing with ghosts?" Miller's voice was pleading. "Frank, listen to me. You're spinning out. Go home. Get some sleep. We've got the shipyard smuggling case tomorrow. Real criminals. Real evidence." Karras closed the notebook. The two warring pages came together, but they did not merge. He looked at his partner, at his honest, worried face, and felt a profound sense of isolation. He was on an island, and the boats back to the mainland were gone. "The evidence doesn't fit the world, Miller," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "It just doesn't." He was a man of faith, not in a god or a heaven, but in a creed, a method, the scientific method. Observation, hypothesis, experimentation, conclusion. It was a religion that had always provided him with answers, that had shielded him from the chaos. And now, his faith was broken. He was lost. And when you're lost, you go to the only place that offers a map, even one written in a language you don't understand. The next day, Karras found himself walking up the steps of a small Catholic church, a place he hadn't set foot in since he was a child. He sought out Father Michael, the priest who had attended to Mary Reeser's son. In their first meeting, Karras had seen him as an opportunist, a purveyor of superstition exploiting a family's grief. Now, he saw him as something else, an expert in a field Karras knew nothing about. He found the priest in his rectory, a simple room filled with books and the smell of lemon polish. Karras didn't waste time with pleasantries. He laid Mary's notes out on the polished wooden desk. "I need you to look at these," he said. Father Michael, a man with kind, intelligent eyes, adjusted his spectacles and peered down at the papers. He read silently for a long time, his expression growing more somber with each page. He did not scoff at the pseudo-scientific language. He simply absorbed it. "Pyroelectric fields," the priest murmured when he was finished. He looked up at Karras. "A new name for an old torment. I have seen this before, detective. Not often, but enough." "Seen what?" Karras pressed. An affliction of the soul so profound it manifests in the flesh, Father Michael said, his voice even. We try to explain it away with science, and sometimes we can. Hysteria, psychosomatic illness. But sometimes it is more. In the old texts, they speak of saints who could feel the fires of God's love so intensely they would blister. They speak of the possessed, whose inner demons could heat the very air around them. Do you know what stigmata is, detective? Bleeding from the hands and feet, Karras replied. Like Christ. Yes, the agony of the soul made real on the body. This, the priest tapped Mary's notes, is a form of stigmata, a terrible fiery kind. She was not a witch or a psychic. She was a woman in torment. This power she feared was not a gift. The devil often promises power, detective, but he only ever delivers destruction. Karras felt a chill, despite the stuffy heat of the room. The priest's words, steeped in ancient belief, somehow resonated with the impossible facts of the case more than any scientific theory had. He had given the phenomenon a name, a context, a history. Father Michael stood and walked to a bookshelf, pulling down a heavy, leather-bound volume. The gold leaf on the spine was faded and cracked. He handed it to Karras. This is an old text, a study of spiritual afflictions and their physical signs. It is full of what you would call superstition. But you are a man looking for answers in a place where your own maps are useless. Perhaps a new map is required. Karras took the book. Its weight felt significant in his hands. He was no longer a detective following a lead. He was an explorer crossing a threshold into a new, terrifying world. The book, combined with a scribbled address in the margins of Mary's journal, a notation about a place of calm, led Karras deep into the Florida countryside, to a dilapidated farmhouse half swallowed by weeds and Spanish moss. The air around the property felt unnaturally still, the cicadas silent. The place felt abandoned by more than just people. As Karras got out of his car, he wasn't thinking like a cop anymore. He wasn't looking for tire tracks or footprints. He was looking for a sanctuary or a crucible, a place where Mary had fought her war alone. He pushed open the creaking front door and stepped inside. The house was empty, save for dust and cobwebs. But in a small back bedroom, he found the heart of it. The walls were lined with thin graying sheets of asbestos, a pathetic scientific attempt to fireproof the room. The air was cold, just like in her apartment. And on the dusty floorboards, Karras saw an impossible fusion. Painted in what looked like house paint were strange, arcane symbols, circles and triangles intertwined, like something from the priest's old book. But drawn right next to them, in precise, drafted chalk lines, were complex electrical diagrams, complete with notations for voltage and resistance. It was a prison cell designed by a physicist and a sorcerer, a desperate, hopeless synthesis of science and magic. He ran his hand along the wall, feeling the cold, dusty asbestos. He was standing in the center of Mary's terror. As he scanned the room, his eyes caught a subtle detail, a single floorboard whose edges didn't quite line up. He knelt down, pried it up with his pocket knife, and found a small, hollow space beneath. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was another journal. He lifted it out, his heart pounding. This was it, the final piece. But as he opened it, he saw at once that the handwriting was not Mary's frantic, looping script. It was a tight, controlled, masculine hand. He flipped to the first page. The entry was dated 2 years ago. Found Mother's old research today. The books from the Edison Society. I thought it was just a silly hobby. It wasn't. The things she wrote. The inner fire. It explains so much. Her reclusiveness, her fear, her hands which were always so cold to the touch. Karras's blood ran cold. He knew the handwriting. It belonged to her son, the nervous, sweating man who had lied to his face. He read on, his hands shaking. The entries documented the son's dawning horror as he realized his mother's condition was not a quirk, but a fundamental aspect of her biology. It has to be genetic, a defect in the blood, a flaw in the engine. Last week, after an argument at work, I felt it for the first time. A warmth behind my ribs. not unpleasant. But I knew what it was. It's in me too. The curse is in me. The journal was a horrifying chronicle of his own secret experiments, trying to replicate and control the power he had inherited. He had found the farmhouse, Mary's old sanctuary, and tried to continue her work. Karras flipped to the last page. The entry was dated just 2 days before Mary's death. The suppressors she built were too weak, based on old technology. She was trying to bottle lightning. I can do better. Stronger capacitors, a more stable regulator. I can build a cage strong enough to hold the fire. I can master it. Karras dropped the journal as if it were on fire. The mystery was solved, but the horror had just begun. The threat wasn't over. It hadn't died with Mary. It had been passed on. It was active, walking around in the world, housed in a terrified man who believed he could tame the sun. He was no longer investigating a death. He was racing against one. The journal felt impossibly heavy in Frank Karras's hands, a testament written in ink and terror. The engine of his Ford roared as he tore through the humid Florida night, the tires screeching around corners. He was no longer a detective pursuing a case. He was a man trying to outrun a conclusion he knew was inevitable. The sun was a ticking bomb, and Karras was the only person on Earth who could hear the clock. He couldn't call it in. The thought was absurd. What would he say to the dispatcher? Send all units to the old Edison Theater. There's a man there who might spontaneously combust. They would send a straitjacket for him, not backup. He was alone, utterly and completely, adrift in a new reality governed by a terrifying fusion of physics and faith. The Sun's journal lay open on the passenger seat, its pages fluttering in the wind from the open window. It was his roadmap, a mad scripture of scientific formulas and desperate prayers. One page held a diagram of a capacitor array designed to handle a massive electrical load. The next held a prayer to St. Jude, patron saint of lost causes, begging for deliverance from the fire in the blood. Karras was no longer just a cop. He was the sole practitioner of a new, terrifying field of study that was part forensics, part parapsychology. He understood the sun wasn't a monster trying to hurt anyone. He was a scientist performing a dangerous experiment on himself, and Karras knew, with chilling certainty, how the last one had ended. He saw the building looming out of the darkness, a derelict silhouette against the moonlit sky, the old Edison Theater. He slammed on the brakes, his car screeching to a halt in a cloud of dust and gravel. The place was a tomb, a monument to a failed dream, where science and superstition had tried to merge and had only succeeded in creating monsters. The air outside the car was thick and unnaturally warm, shimmering with a visible heat that rose from the building itself. A low, electrical hum vibrated through the soles of his shoes, a deep, resonant thrumming that felt like the building was breathing. He grabbed his revolver, the cold steel a familiar but useless comfort, and ran towards the entrance. He kicked open the heavy oak doors and plunged into the main hall. The sight that met him was something out of a madman's vision. In the center of the vast, dusty space, Richard, the son, stood like a fly caught in a spider's web. A massive, jury-rigged version of his mother's suppressor surrounded him, a chaotic tangle of thick cables, glowing vacuum tubes, and humming copper rods that all converged on a harness strapped to his chest. The air crackled with ozone. The hum was deafening now, the sound of an engine pushed far beyond its limits. Richard's skin was flushed a deep, angry red, and beneath it, a faint, sickly orange light seemed to pulse in time with the hum of the machine. His eyes were wide, staring at nothing, his body rigid with a terrible, focused energy. He was chanting, his voice strained, a bizarre litany that was half engineering checklist, half desperate prayer. Field integrity at 98%, capacitors holding steady. He muttered, sweat pouring down his face. Oh God, grant me control. Don't let me burn. Please God, don't let me burn like she did. Karras saw it all in a flash of terrible understanding. Richard wasn't just controlling the energy. He was gathering it, drawing it into himself, believing he could contain it, master it. He was the ultimate victim of the warring forces that had torn his mother apart. a man trying to use the cold logic of science to cage the primal terror of a superstitious curse. And the cage was about to break. Sparks began to fly from an overloaded transformer, showering the floor in a cascade of incandescent blue. The hum intensified, rising in pitch to a painful shriek. The orange light under Richard's skin grew brighter. Karras's training screamed at him, his hand tightening on his revolver. He saw a threat, a human bomb about to detonate. The old Karras, the man who believed in neat, simple solutions, would have raised his gun. But the old Karras was gone. He lowered the weapon. He saw not a threat to be neutralized, but a victim to be saved. He didn't shout police commands. He didn't yell, "Freeze!" or "Get down!" He shouted the only language the man in the cage would understand. He shouted phrases from the journals. "Richard, the field is unstable!" Karras's voice boomed across the hall, cutting through the electronic shriek. "Your mother's notes. She said you can't contain it. You have to ground it. Let it go." Richard's head snapped towards him, his eyes wide with shock. He was being spoken to in his own secret language. "It's not a curse!" Karras yelled, taking a step forward. "It's energy. Just energy. Your mother was afraid of it, and her fear destroyed her. You don't have to be afraid. You can release it." He was no longer a cop. He was a priest, a scientist, a translator between two worlds. He was using the language of faith to achieve a scientific goal, discharging the energy. As the main capacitor bank began to glow cherry red, on the verge of melting down, Richard screamed, a raw, primal sound of pure terror and release. He looked up at the ceiling, his body arching back. A brilliant, utterly silent flash of orange light erupted from his chest. It was not a fire, it was pure energy, a noiseless detonation that lit the entire theater for a split second. The light arced through the air, hitting the copper rods of the machine, which acted as a massive lightning rod. The energy flowed through the cables, and with a deafening, explosive crack, the main transformer blew apart, plunging the hall into darkness and silence. Richard collapsed to the floor in a heap, unharmed. Karras stood in the sudden, ringing quiet, his heart hammering against his ribs, the smell of ozone thick in his throat. Months later, Karras sat at his desk. It was no longer a perfect grid. The papers were in neat piles, but they were just piles. A little bit of chaos had been allowed back into his world. The official reports lay in front of him, monuments to a truth that could never be told. Mary Reeser, death by misadventure. Richard's case was closed. Attempted arson. The world had its tidy, logical explanations. Miller walked over, sipping a coffee. "Morning, Frank. You ever figure out what really happened with that Reeser case?" Karras looked at the files. Then he looked at two books sitting on the corner of his desk. One was the ancient, leather-bound text on spiritual afflictions the priest had given him. Next to it was a brand new university textbook titled An Introduction to Human Biophysics. He smiled faintly, a genuine, tired smile. "Sometimes the how is less important than the why," he said. "And sometimes the world is bigger than the rules we write for it." He left the two books sitting side by side. They didn't fight. They didn't contradict each other. They were just two different maps for the same vast and mysterious territory. What's fascinating about a story like this isn't the mystery itself, but what the mystery does to the people who have to confront it. The official reports, death by misadventure, attempted arson, are neat, tidy lies. They're a way for the world to keep making sense. But we know the truth is far stranger. The story gives us so many different names for the same terrifying power. A pyroelectric field, a curse of the blood, a fiery stigmata. Are these science, superstition, and faith just different languages trying to describe the same impossible thing? Detective Karras starts as a man who believes only in the rules. But to solve this, he can't just follow the evidence. He has to learn to read it in a language he never believed in. He doesn't throw away his science, but he's forced to place it next to a book on ancient theology. admitting both might be pointing at the same truth. It suggests that the most profound discoveries aren't made in a lab, but in the terrifying moment we realize our map of the world is incomplete. It leaves you wondering, when faced with something that shatters your understanding of reality, which do you trust? The evidence right in front of your eyes, or the rules you thought governed the world?